Welcome back. We're talking about the role of conscience in our system of government. And in particular, we're focusing on, at this precise point in the conversation, we're focusing on the ability of jurors to give voice to their conscience. In particular, we're talking about the right, I'm going to argue that it is a right, and power of jurors to acquit against the evidence, to just say no, to refuse in the federal criminal justice system, to just say no, in the state criminal justice system for that matter, to just say no to criminal punishment that they think is unconscionable, is just too savage, and they refuse to participate in this kind of savagery. So let's imagine, for example, that the statute on the book says, well, anyone who steals a slice of pizza or a baseball glove or a golf club, if he has 2 prior offenses, well, this is his 3rd strike, and he has to go to prison for the rest of his life. And let's imagine that it's pretty clear. There's a video camera, and it shows that he's taken the slice of pizza out there without having paid, or the baseball glove, or the golf club, and you're on the jury, and he did it. He's guilty. But you really wonder whether he deserves life imprisonment for that, whether that punishment really genuinely fits the crime. Do you have the right and power to acquit against the evidence, because the evidence suggests that he's guilty? This is the issue of what critics call juror nullification. It has a long history in the Anglo-American world, going all the way back to the 1670s in England, a case called Bushell's case. A jury simply refused to convict, and the judges tried to actually punish the juror for that, and the ruling eventually came down, though, that they couldn't do that. Jurors can acquit against the evidence and can't be punished for that. In America, a case involving a man named Zenger. He was on trial in New York in the 1730s. He had published some items critical of the government, and the law said that that was a crime, but the jury, very famously in the Zenger case, simply said, well, we're not going to convict. And he went free, because you can't, basically, in America, hold someone convict someone if a jury just says no. Blackstone, whom we encountered earlier in this course, referred to a practice that he called pious perjury. It was a certain kind of perjury, a false swearing, but it was kind of pious. It was admirable. Here's how it worked in England. In England, if you stole an item worth more than £1, that was grand larceny, and that was a death penalty offense. But if the item that you stole was worth less than £1, that was petty larceny, and it wasn't a death penalty offense. You get shipped off to Australia or Georgia, but they wouldn't hang you. The question of how much the value of the item stolen was worth was basically a question for the jury. And in all sorts of cases, a person stole a horse, and the horse is worth way more than £1. But the jury basically came back with a verdict of petty larceny, not grand larceny. They just said, we think that this horse wasn't worth more than £1. And of course they know that the horse was worth more than £1. What they were really doing is saying, the guy's guilty, he deserves some punishment, but not this savage of punishment, not death, something less harsh, less savage than that. And Blackstone referred to this, as I said, as pious perjury. It was a certain kind of false swearing. They were saying the guy was innocent of grand larceny when he was guilty, but it was done for kind of admirable reasons. There was a certain merciful component here, piety. They're not allowed to convict when the person is innocent. They're allowed to acquit when the person is guilty. Note the asymmetry here. Less punishment is okay than the law authorizes, never more. Now you might say, okay, well, but is that really is a power in America? Why is it the power in America? Because once the jury says no, you can't retry the defendant. Double jeopardy kicks in. Jeopardy has attached. A jury acquittal means that once the verdict comes in, the defendant is quit. He's done. That's what an acquittal is. It's over. But there are several other. So there's a power, a raw power of jurors to do this. But I would say not just a power, a right, because there are several technical doctrines in our law that really reflect the right of the jury to say no, even against the evidence. On the civil side, if the evidence is absolutely clear that the defendant is guilty, is liable to the plaintiff for damages, the judge can simply just order a thing called summary judgment, can basically say judgment for the plaintiff. Judges are not allowed to do that in a criminal case. In a civil case, even a judge can direct the jury, can tell the jury, you must find the defendant liable to the plaintiff. Judges are not allowed to do that in the criminal case, in the criminal side, only in the civil side. After a jury has come back in a civil case with a judgment for the defendant, a judge can set that aside, actually, and order a new trial, or actually, it's called judgment notwithstanding the verdict, can basically overturn a jury that sides with a civil defendant. A judge can overturn that in the civil side, not on the criminal side. So there are a whole bunch of rules on the criminal justice system that guarantee that if a defendant wants a jury, he can get a jury. And if the jury and the judge can't tell the jury that it must convict, and the judge can't, when the jury comes back with an acquittal, can't undo that in any way, done is done, double jeopardy, acquittal, these doctrines reflect not merely the raw power of juries to acquit, but fundamentally their right to do so as part of our special system protecting liberty in the federal criminal justice system, and protecting the role of juror conscience in the system. We want ordinary people to participate in the process, and we want them to feel good about the system afterwards. And will they feel good about the system if they're being asked to do things that they think are deeply unconscionable, to send people to very savage punishments that they think really aren't warranted? Are ordinary people going to want to participate in the system if that's the case? So our system actually allows jurors to just say no. But here's the kicker. It doesn't tell jurors that. There is this right and power of jury nullification, but jurors aren't told about this. And it's a scary power. It's a dangerous power. It can be used for bad things. Yes, in the Zenger case, the jury stood up for freedom of speech and of the press. And yes, in Bushell's case, the jury actually was siding with a very sympathetic defendant, who actually happened to be William Penn, the proprietor of, later to be the proprietor of Pennsylvania, the colony of Pennsylvania. And that was a case involving certain religious liberty and other things. But so there is a grant, and yes, sometimes jurors can be very merciful, and we think there was a generosity there, a bigness of heart. But in America, jury nullification has also been used for very bad purposes. Klansmen, thugs, have killed or maimed black people. And all white juries just said, well, we're not going to convict for that. We're going to let you get away with murder, get away with rape. We're going to let you lynch people, and we're going to look the other way. We're going to acquit against the evidence. A very famous case in the 1950s involved a young black youth named Emmett Till, and he was savagely murdered for making an inappropriate sexual gesture, a pass, at a white woman. And he was brutally killed, and an all-white jury acquitted the murderers within an hour, and basically said, if we hadn't actually stopped to drink a soda pop, it wouldn't have taken us that long. So jury nullification is a two-edged sword. It has been used for bad purposes in America as well as good purposes, but It is a right and power of the jury. And my suggestion is that jurors should be told about it. We should take jury nullification and bring it out of the shadows, bring it into the open. Judges should tell jurors about this power, tell jurors about how it's been used, admirably in American history, the Zenger case, how it's been used in disgraceful situations, and try to give them some guidance about when it's appropriate and when not. In effect, just like we Mirandize defendants and explain to them their rights against compelled self-incrimination, we could Zengerize and Tillize would-be jurors and tell them about this. If you've seen this MOOC, you actually now know about jury nullification. If you read the book chapter, you'll know even more about jury nullification. But if you don't know that and you just come in and you're summoned to jury service, you might have kind of slightly confused ideas about this. You might not know about it at all. And some jurors might know about it and others not. And that's not what the system is about. The system is about using jury service as a way of reconnecting the citizens with their Constitution, of enlisting your conscience, of making you feel actually that you are a citizen in a self-governing republic. And actually and there's not just one of you, there are a bunch of you, and you're talking together and deliberating in a morally and legally serious way. Our system doesn't do that today. It should. Now, there are probably going to need to be some other reforms if we move down this road. I think it may very well be that jurors, and by the way, how to avoid the Emmett Till situations, I think the biggest key is making sure that our jurors really reflect America. The problem in the Till case was really that it was an all-white jury because blacks were excluded from jury service at the time. They weren't allowed to vote illegally in violation of the 15th Amendment in much of the Deep South. This is a case that came out of the South in the 1950s. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to serve on juries. When you have all-white jurors and that exclude other folks, you're going to get sometimes verdicts like this. So I think the key is to bring everyone in, everyone onto the jury, to have it be genuinely a cross-section reflecting America. But if we do that as a practical matter, maybe jurors aren't going to be unanimous. It's going to be hard to insist that if we really bring in all the diversity of America, it may be hard to expect them to always to agree on things. At the founding, jurors were unanimous, but that's because lots of folks were excluded: unpropertied people, African Americans, women. In a more diverse society, if everyone comes onto the jury, it may not be reasonable to expect that the jury is going to be unanimous. Remember, judges aren't unanimous. The Supreme Court divides 5-4. Senate's often not unanimous. The House is not unanimous. If we have non-unanimity elsewhere in our system, by the way, civil juries don't need to be unanimous. Grand juries don't need to be unanimous. Maybe pettit juries, trial juries in the criminal side don't need to be unanimous. Now, I could just say the Constitution doesn't require unanimity, and you say, well, Professor, you can't just hide behind that, because you've said there's all sorts of unwritten things in the Constitution. And isn't jury unanimity an unwritten constitutional principle? And I say, well, let's think about that. There are certain unwritten principles about the jury. The jury has to, for example, in my view, have 12 people. Doesn't say so in so many words, but that's what the founders understood a jury to be. Today's Supreme Court said, oh, no, it doesn't have to be 12. Criminal jury can have 6 people. 5's too small, but 6 is okay, says the Supreme Court. And you should be saying at this point, huh? Like, where did they come up with that? Why is 5 too small and 6 is okay? They just made that up. And you could say, well, Professor, 12 is made up. And I said, in a sense it's made up. It has a lot of history. At the founding, jurors were always 12. That's basically been true for almost all of American history and almost all the states. So there's a lot of history and tradition going into that. When the framers said the word jury, they actually meant a system that they actually had experience with, that they had inherited, and that body was, in the phrase at the time, 12 good men and true. Today it has to be good men and women and true. But 12 was 12, and that's what the word jury really codified. And as I said, that has been our almost unbroken practice by the overwhelming majority of states and the federal government since the founding. And once you go below 12, Why stop at 6? There's just no principled stopping point. Now, once you go beyond unanimity, there actually are principled stopping points. Surely, there have to be at least a majority of people willing to convict. So you need at least 7 of the 12. And I would say, look, if you look at the Constitution as a whole, think about impeachment. Impeachment, 2/3 of the Senate, which infects it as the jury, has to convict. And that's not a capital punishment in impeachment. That's just taking away someone's office and possibly disqualifying them for future office. But if it takes 2/3 to do that, it should take at least 2/3 more to imprison someone or impose serious criminal punishment. So, at least 9 of the 12. And that's kind of a structural idea. By the way, today, even though we say, sometimes jury unanimity, it's not quite true. Suppose the jury in the first case hangs. Let's say, actually, it hangs, 6-6 or something. Well, you can have a retrial. And the retrial, yes, you're convicted 12-0. And you say, well, that's unanimous. But only because we're not sort of counting those, first 6 who voted for you. We say it's 12-0, but it's really 18-6. 12 plus 6 against 6 on the other side. So we, in effect, today, because of retrial, our system, has had non-unanimous jurors. And as I said, if you understand that civil juries don't need to be unanimous and grand juries don't need to be unanimous in the House and the Senate, they've never been, had a unanimity requirement as a general rule, and neither have the judges. I think if we're going to have open up jury service to everyone, and have serious conversations about whether punishment is really too savage or not, people are going to disagree. On day one, in order to get people to talk to each other on the jury, to have this candid discussion about conscience among conscientious citizens, on day one, maybe you need 12-0 to convict in order to make sure that everyone gets listened to, that Henry Fonda has a time to make his case. So maybe day one or first 2 days has to be unanimous. And then after that, 11-1 for conviction could suffice. Maybe after a couple more days, 10-2 could suffice. 9-3 is the bedrock. And after a certain point, if there are not 9 votes to convict, I think you could just say, well, that counts as an acquittal. In the same way that when a president is impeached, anything less than 2/3, you don't retry the thing. That counts as an acquittal. Anything less than 2/3 in the Senate in an impeachment court, that's an acquittal. You could do the same thing here. 12-0 on day 1, 10-2 on day 3, 9-3 will suffice on day 5, just to give the early dissenters a chance to sort of make their case, make their appeal to conscience for the others. And if at the end of the day, at the end of a week or whatever, you don't get to the requisite supermajority, that could count as a case-ending acquittal. Okay. I'm going to end by talking a little bit. We've been talking a lot about jurors and their conscience. What about the judicial conscience? I want to tell you about these 2 characters. I say characters, but they're actually heroes of mine. There are many heroes of mine. Some are conservative, some are liberal. These were liberal heroes of mine. William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall, they were on the Warren Court, and after a certain point, they basically refused to sign off on any death penalty that came before them. They basically said, we think the death penalty, we're not going to, we're going to vote against every capital punishment. And although they said, because we think it's cruel and unusual everywhere, it's not unusual in America that we have capital offenses. So it's hard to be cruel and unusual if it's not unusual. So I think what they were really saying is not, we think the death penalty is unusual in America because it's practiced in America for certain heinous crimes. What they were really saying, I think, is we think the death penalty is unconscionable. We as individuals can't sign our names to these death warrants. We think we have blood on our hands. Yes, we're going to engage in a certain kind of pious perjury. We're going to say the person is guilty, they should be punished, but not with death, something less than that, because we don't want blood on our hands. This was ultimately an appeal a conscience of a certain sort. They said they thought they claimed it was unconstitutional. I think what they really were saying is it's unconscionable. Late in his career on the Supreme Court, Justice Harry Blackmun said something rather similar. Justice Stevens, shortly before retirement, came close to this position. It was a more modified version. But I just basically want to, and it was a certain kind of civil disobedience, maybe. I am appealing to my fellow citizens, telling them that I'm not going to participate in this system, which violates my deep sense of fairness and conscience and morality. Now, it is dangerous when judges just decide cases according to their own conscience. It's very dangerous. But I just want you to note a few things about this. Number one, this appeal to conscience is asymmetric. It's not saying, I think the person deserves more punishment than law allows. You're not allowed to do that. Our system is asymmetric. It's tilted in favor of the criminal defendant. Less punishment is okay than the law permits, than the statute requires, never more. Cruel and unusual punishments are impermissible, but merciful and unusual punishments are not necessarily impermissible. So the system is tilted. It's asymmetric. It's in favor of the defendant, his life, his liberty. So note the asymmetry here, that they're being pious. They're being merciful in this judgment. They're having pity on the soul of the person standing in front of them. Note also that this is a domain where judges have cut juries out of the loop. And maybe jurors were supposed to be more involved, but because judges have cut them out, not telling them about jury nullification, about acquittals against the evidence, maybe the judiciary has a special role to fill this conscience gap that the judiciary has itself created. Third, note that this is, again, only in a certain domain. It's only in the criminal justice system where judges are doing things to people standing in front of them, face to face, in a system that they have a lot of first-hand knowledge of. They have an intimate familiarity, judges do, with the criminal justice system in a way that ordinary citizens don't. I'm not sure that the judicial conscience is any better than the consciences of theologians and philosophers and morally serious human beings on all sorts of issues, on abortion, on school prayer, on affirmative action. I'm not at all sure that the judicial conscience is any better than the consciences of fellow citizens. But in the criminal justice system, it may very well be that judges actually do know that system and see its savagery and unfairness way more than the rest of us do, because we don't daily interact with the criminal justice system in a way that judges do. So they may have more expertise here. And maybe more of a role to play in telling the rest of us how it looks to them. And they are more personally complicit in this because they are signing death warrants and savage criminal punishments, 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimums with their own hands. These savage, they say, over-punishment of victimless crime in drug cases or in 3 strikes cases. So it may very well be that there's possibly, at least I just want you to think about this possibly, a special role for conscience in the criminal justice system. I'm actually going to end with a judge who says the following. This is actually a judge writing in a law review article. What if some state should enact a new law providing public lashing or branding the right hand as a punishment for certain criminal offenses, even if it could be demonstrated unequivocally that these measures were not cruel and unusual measures in 1791, and even though no prior Supreme Court decision had specifically disapproved them, I doubt whether any federal judges, even among the many who consider themselves originalists, would sustain them against Eighth Amendment challenge. I confess, says this judge, that in a crunch, I may prove a faint-hearted originalist. This judge says he's an originalist, but in cases involving savage punishment, he may prove a faint-hearted originalist. I cannot imagine myself, any more than any other federal judge, upholding a statute that opposes the punishment of flogging. So who was that judge? Was it, a liberal squish like Thurgood Marshall or William Brennan? The judge who wrote that was Judge Antonin Scalia. famous conservative, known for his kind of hard-nosed view of the law. But in that he's saying, I'm a judge, but I'm also a human being. I have conscience. I have a conscience. It's particularly activated or when in the criminal justice system where I'm being asked to sign on to certain savage punishments. And so you hear Justice Scalia sort of wondering aloud about what his proper role is as a human being. America's written constitution depends on actual human beings working the system. And we want men and women of conscience to participate in the system as our system depends on public participation. Voting on election day, being willing to serve in office if summoned by your federal citizen, your fellow citizens, to serve on a jury, to be willing to be a judge. And we want men and women of conscience to do that. And so the claim is for America's Constitution to work and work well, we need to think seriously about what role we want to recognize for conscience in our system. Conscience, I submit, is an important part of America's unwritten Constitution. One more chapter to go. Stay tuned.